Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to review Kidnapping Stella. So, originally I had reviewed this before, so if people came back into here just like, oh, this is a new review, and then they'll see me again, I'm like, hello. Really, I'd reviewed this before with a combo movie called The Intruder. And bizarrely, that video just did well for some reason I don't quite understand. And so really I just got on here, I was like, well, hey, since that was successful there, let's come back with a new setup and just re-review this here. See what happens. When going into this movie, I honestly thought I was kind of just going to see this kind of generic kidnapping movie when I originally saw it. And then I realized, I'm like, oh wow, there's actually quite a bit of backstory here. There's actually at points in time when you can actually invest in the characters in this movie. I'm like, oh, okay. So it seems like there is something actually there that I thought was just kind of fascinating when watching this film. Really, when watching this movie, I did kind of enjoy the fact that we not only have to root for Stella getting out of this, but then also we end up having to bizarrely root for Tom's character in this movie, because we have it to where it seems that there is a lesser of two evils thing going on within this movie. And we end up finding out there's an entire reason why Stella was actually kidnapped, which I thought was interesting. So we go along here and reasonably have it be that these guys are really smart about this whole kidnapping thing, even though that sounds horrible to say. Like, they are doing this in an environment that isn't exactly heavily populated. They are going and putting sound dampeners all over the wall of which that this girl is at. They are boarding up all windows and all kinds of things. So, of course, no one would see, and blah, 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 blah. We end up having these people being very smart about this, and we eventually have it to where eventually there's an interesting story that eventually comes out of this. Eventually, we end up finding out that there is more than meets the eye with this story, and that's the thing that I could really eventually enjoy about it. Going into this movie, I would say it kind of gets to the point to where I think in a lot of kidnapping situations, I think really this story eventually kind of rings true. We eventually have it to where somebody who ended up kidnapping a person eventually starts to getting some guilt or remorse of even doing this. And we eventually have it to where it seems that eventually some people will just let a person go, and so on and so forth, because it's the right thing to do, and blah, 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 blah. But that may or may not happen in this story. That may or may not go the way we are thinking within this film. But anyways, so really I think I almost kind of covered everything. I think I kind of covered everything that I wanted to say in a very cryptic-like sense. Because there's some stuff that I would immediately want to say, but it would spoil the movie. So for people that haven't seen this and want to check it out, I honestly thought that it was actually a pretty interesting film. I actually did enjoy it to the point of me going like, okay, it seems like this did well, so F it, I'll review it again, I'll watch it again, because I actually did like it. So, really we have it to a point in time where this girl kind of goes through certain rungs of being kidnapped, to the point of her having to, pee and or poop in buckets and stuff, so if people don't like that, that's, your prerogative. Also, we end up having at some point that this Stella girl ends up basically stripped down. So eventually they put new clothes on her. So letting everybody know that that happens. Um, so I guess they can kind of control her and be able to not have to worry that she has some kind of uh, thing in her back pocket or whatever, and so on and so forth. It was a way of kind of controlling her. We end up having most of the time, this girl is tied up onto a bed, and so reasonably, like this girl isn't going to easily and quickly escape, but there are some moments in this film where it seems that Stella more and more gets to be almost close to escaping, and bravo for that, I guess. So, with that said, let's go into the spoiler territory of this movie, and so let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, we immediately in the very beginning of this film, we end up having Tom and Vic who are going along and going into some kind of warehouse or wood shop or convenience store or whichever, and uh, going and trying to find pieces for them to be able to do this kidnapping. They are looking at things to sound dampen their room, and they are trying to find wood pieces to cover up windows. So we have a very strategic and technically sound approach about doing a kidnapping. So after that, we eventually also have them like get masks, and like you'll see a lot of the stuff that ends up going into the movie of what they all strategically did. So we end up having it to where they eventually go and grab and nab Stella. And so immediately the first thing that they do is they end up cutting all of her clothes off of her to eventually put her in a sweatshirt and sweatpants. Uh, really, I guess to kind of very much like control her and like basically have it if something were to happen um, with uh, with her actual like basically it's like they realize or rationalize that it's like, well, hey, we're gonna cut like we're gonna have this girl have like her own clothes because we're gonna try to have the clothes that can last the longest, no matter how long that this girl is in here. And more than likely, if some accident were to happen while this girl was having these clothes on, I'm sure they had plenty of pairs for her to just exchange out of. So going into this, the first thing that Vic ends up doing is asking this girl's father's cell phone number and email address. And so we end up having a very good reason for why they chose this girl. Evidently, she's an only child, and it seems that her family is fairly wealthy. We end up having an alternative motive for why this girl was chosen, but we'll get to that. So, we end up having Vic, who is starting to notice that it seems that Tom has difficulty eating. And so we end up having Vic, who is basically forcing Tom to eat, shoving the food in his mouth because Vic wants to make sure that Tom is not, in so and so words, losing sleep over this. Because basically, if Tom is losing sleep over this, then Tom is second guessing things, and Vic does not want that. Um, so we end up having it to where Vic is to go off and to eventually try to talk to this girl's father to try and get ransom and so on and so forth. And we end up finding out that Stella's uh, father is not interested. We also have it to where eventually Tom is to eventually go in And it seems we end up having Stella at points in time need to go to the bathroom. We end up having it to where they are to bring in like a medical device to help her pee. Like they basically just bring like buckets and some kinds of things to have her pee or poop. To where we have it to where we have both Tom and Vic who are basically right then and there holding a bucket to Stella's vajayjay for her to just urinate while they're kind of like looking away, so that way kind of give her privacy a little bit. We end up having it to where eventually when Tom goes in there to check on Stella, we end up having Stella who mentions that she, by fingers, needs to go take a crap. So we end up having it to where Tom ends up going and giving her a bucket to poop. And we end up having Stella mention that, could you just look away for a little bit? Like, I just can't poop with you looking at me. So we end up having it to where Tom eventually tells her, it's like, well, I can't leave the room. And so we eventually have it to where eventually Stella does get the drop on Tom, and eventually Stella ends up actually getting the gun away from Tom, and eventually also takes his mask off to eventually reveal that it is Tom. So now we have to get to a pin here where we have to tell how now Tom and Stella know one another, because that's a part of the movie as well. We end up finding out that it seems that Tom had went to prison, and Stella and Tom were lovers, and it seems that Tom is bitter of the fact that he had went to prison and like Stella wasn't there for him, and that like we don't know exactly why Tom had went to prison. That point wasn't actually said within this movie, but it seems that Tom was just bitter that Stella was never there for him, so that's why he revenging wise went after her, because I guess she never went to see him in prison, so that's why he was just so angry and upset with her that that Tom, I guess, thought that Stella loved him, but maybe not enough. So we end up having it to where, because of Tom's jealousy, that's where he starts to get sloppy. So we eventually have it to where Tom is telling Stella, it's like, well, hey, like, I am going to give you the keys because she is still cuffed to the bed. And we end up having Tom who's like, hey, I'm going to give you the keys for your handcuffs so you can go. And so we end up having it to where we have Tom who is giving Stella the keys. And so we end up having it to where Tom bum rushes Stella, and she ends up firing a round off. And so we eventually end up having it to where eventually uh, Tom eventually goes on to eventually almost have Stella almost escape at one point. She is like grabbing her phone, trying to call 911, because we end up having instead Tom who ends up getting handcuffed to the bed, and we end up having Stella who ends up trying to run off. Because we end up having Tom who ends up trying to put Stella back onto the bed and tries to handcuff her, and she gets free and then tries to handcuff Tom to the bed, and then she runs off to eventually try to call 911. And so we end up having it to where Stella needs to get back into that room to get the keys to open up this door. We end up having Tom who ends up injuring Stella, and then and we also have it to where Stella is wanting to tell Tom something, some secret, some dark, deep down secret that she has. that Tom like didn't want to hear her out, and so we have it to where Stella tries to get to the keys. Tom ends up booting freaking Stella in the head, and so that ends up knocking her out. Having Tom with the ability now to put Stella back onto the bed, and so we end up having Victor, who ends up uh, coming back in, uh, just going like, "Hey, did anything happen? Like, was anything exciting happening?" We end up having also Tom before Vic had arrived. Tom is telling Stella that she should not say anything about Tom and her being the best of friends or whatever, because Vic will go and kill her off and also kill him. So we have it to where Stella is sworn to silence with Vic, but eventually we end up finding out that Vic is going to eventually find things and figure things out. So we eventually have it to where Vic goes in and he's like, you know what? Like, I think we should actually just like feed her. You know what? I think we should actually go in and just um, like feed her. Like, I think it's about that time. So we have Vic who ends up going in and trying to feed um, Stella soup, and Stella wants Tom to feed her, and Vic's like, no, like I'm already feeding you. Who? What's the point of whoever is doing it? So we eventually realize that Tom is noticing there is the uh, there is one part of the bullet that is now on the ground, and so we end up having Tom, who is trying to figure out a way to get to that bullet piece, and so we end up having Tom trying to conveniently come up with a way, and eventually Vic ends up dropping the spoon of the thing that Stella is eating soup from. And so we end up having conveniently Tom, who is grabbing the bullet and the part of the bullet and the the spoon, and we end up having Vic, who's like, "What are you doing? Like, give me that." And so we end up having Vic, who is now like very suspicious of Tom, to where like Vic is asking him, "It's like, what are you doing? Like, what is wrong with you?" And so, because we end up having Tom, who ends up trying to get rid of the bullet piece, and he ends up failing miserably, shoving it into a toilet, trying to flush the toilet, and it's not working. We end up having, I think, Tom at one point just having to eat a part of this bullet, and so we end up having Vic going like, "What's wrong with you? Like, what's going on with the toilet? Like, you're doing so many like suspicious things that like I just want to know the answer of all of this." And we end up having Tom was like, "Well, hey man, like the toilet was busted. Like, maybe we should come in and have somebody fix that or something." So going along into here, so we eventually have it to where it seems that Stella's father is not going to pay out the ransom, and so Vic ends up wanting to put a video, because they had already done videos, or they've already done pictures of her before, like uh, with a newspaper next to her, uh, and kind of evidence of like them taking her. So you eventually have a video, a live video, or not a live streamed video, but like a video. So we end up having Vic, who is going to basically chop off Stella's pinky. But Vic mentions to Stella, it's like, well, yeah, we're going to chop off your pinky, but like we're going to keep it on ice, and like if your father pays out within 24 hours, then you'll get your pinky back. There'll be doctors that can be able to reattach that, and you'll be fine. So we end up having Stella, who is now yelling and screaming, and for her father to pay up, even to the point to where Stella eventually tells her father that she's 4 months pregnant, or like 4 weeks or 4 months. I don't remember what the real true consensus of it was, So we have it to where Tom, I think, is probably doing the math in his head, and he's like, oh shit. And so we end up having Stella, who is to tell that she's pregnant, but you end up having the whole time where Tom is thinking that she's making this up so they would be easy on her or whatever. And eventually we end up having it to where this video that they had done like seemed very convincing for their father to pay up, for Stella's father to pay up. So we eventually go along and we eventually have it to where it seems that Stella's father is going to pay up. And so we end up having them decide like, okay, well, uh it's time to get Stella to go to another location. So we end up having Vic, who eventually goes and is trying to untie Stella and eventually inject her with something that is going to let her sleep during this whole process. And so we end up having a Vic eventually realize that it seems that Stella has a cell phone on her and she called 911. And Vic is like, well, what the heck? Like, how is it that you got this cell phone? Did Tom give it to you? Um, and so eventually we end up having Stella eventually splurge and say that she knew Tom and that reasonably like they used to be lovers and all this and that. She basically like mentions everything to this Vic character because she has to be honest about what all is going on because this guy is going to kill her anyways. So we end up having it to where Vic is asking Stella uh, if she knows his name. Say my name, woman. And of course she can't. So we end up having it to where Vic and Tom are to go to some location because they end up taking Stella and taking her to some like boat dock or whatever. And so we end up having both Tom and Vic who ends up going into this woods like location. And so we end up having it to where supposedly this is the location of where they were supposed to drop the money. And so we end up having Tom and Vic going there to have Tom realize that there is no money dropped off in this location. And so it's because Vic had planned that all along to have them be in two separate locations. The real money drop is actually in a different location. And so Vic just wanted them to be there because he did not trust Tom. And so if Tom was ever to wussy out or whatever, then Vic would take him to this location to just kill him off. So we end up having it to where there is a shootout going on with Tom and Vic, and only Vic has a gun. So we end up having Tom, who is trying to run off, to eventually get shot. And so Tom is not actually dead, but we end up having Vic, who's like, well, I guess he's going to die. So we end up having Vic, who ends up making his way back to Stella to give her an injection that is going to kill her off. And so that way no one will know who Vic is or reveal what his face is to anyone, and he'll get away with this. So we end up having it to where Tom is to eventually come in and try to basically save Stella, and basically he is left with another bullet for his troubles. And so we end up having both of these guys kind of like wrestling and eventually getting a gun shot for his trouble. But eventually we have Tom, who ends up shooting Vic in the head and killing him. So we end up having Tom, who ends up scrambling for the keys to give to Stella so that way she can unlock herself and be able to get free. And then eventually we end up having Stella, who ends up grabbing Tom, because it kind of feels like they do still love one another, even at one point in this movie where Tom and Stella are kind of undeniably, while Stella is like still tied up, we end up having Tom and Stella like kissing one another, and it's just undeniable that they still have feelings for one another. So we end up having Stella who ends up taking Tom and basically watching him die. To where eventually we end up having Stella who I would assess or assume ends up getting out of here and ends up like that's the way of which that this movie just ends with Stella getting into a car and just driving off with a ton of money. We don't know if actually Stella ends up going back to her family or ends up just running off with the money. I would assume she probably does run off with the money because I don't like it seems like her and her father are actually pretty distant, and plus also with $4 million, like that would take care of her, her baby, and anything else that comes after that. So, and plus two, like I wouldn't have blamed her if she would just run off and never have been seen again. Like if she was a celebrity or whichever, it would have been a little bit hard for her to try to hide or whatever. But anyways, yeah, like I think that's all that I wanted to say about this film, and it only took me 26 minutes to cover this film. Just because really, it's kind of an interesting movie. I really do enjoy it. I hope that there wasn't one point that I did like forget and or rush through this film, like forget something. But with that said, I think that I am going to get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, everybody.